Sermons. The signature feature of the work of a rabbi, and, in my estimation, the signature work of clergy people in other faiths as well. We can't live without them, and we have an interesting way of living with them. Allow me to explain. Rabbi Margaret Moores-Wenig, professor of homiletics, that is, sermon giving, at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, has taught sermons are a conversation between rabbi and congregation. Now, this is interesting because sermons do not immediately read as interactive. In fact, some of the stories you hear of congregations interrupting rabbi's sermons, you might have heard stories of this happening long ago, or even as recently as this year. These stories illustrate that the way a sermon is supposed to work is that the rabbi speaks and the community listens. So if that's true, where does the conversation come in? Well, the average rabbi's sermon on a Shabbat morning is somewhere between 10 and 25 minutes in length. Now, some of you are thinking, 25 minutes? I try to be a bit more succinct than that. But even if the rabbi does speak for 25 minutes, that leaves almost 7 days, almost one full week, between one sermon and the next. That time, that almost 7-day interval, that span beginning right when the sermon ends until the next week's sermon begins, that is when the congregation participates in the conversation. For about 10 to 25 minutes a week, the rabbi speaks. Then for almost 7 days, the rabbi listens. Speaking for myself, I'm confident my colleagues would agree, we hear a lot of interesting things. Sometimes the feedback is practical. People can't hear, for example, from a certain area of the room or from the live stream. This feedback shows that people want to hear, want to pay attention, want to be included. This is good feedback. We can make adjustments and improve the situation. Yet more often, the feedback is personal. Roughly, it takes the form of, Rabbi, I liked your sermon, or Rabbi, I didn't like your sermon. From my perspective, this is where the conversation between rabbi and congregation really gets interesting. Now, this is my 8th year in the field. I have over 7 years of experience working as a rabbi. I've had the opportunity to do a variety of things and to give many sermons. When I became rabbi of Adat Shalom, over 2 years ago now, I began for the first time to give a Shabbat morning sermon every week. In previous experience, I had been part of a rabbinic team, giving either a Friday night or Shabbat morning sermon, or I had been with the community that did a Shabbat morning teaching discussion, not a sermon. And so it's been a journey, and honestly, a really fun one, for me to develop a relationship with this weekly Shabbat morning sermon, and with this particular way of having a conversation between rabbi and community. I've learned over time that writing a weekly sermon is less like being an author and more like being a journalist. You're always on a deadline, and every week is different, meaning some weeks are more interesting than others. So this personal feedback, Rabbi, I liked your sermon, Rabbi, I didn't like your sermon, sometimes it is impacted by how interesting the week has been. Some weeks bring with them really interesting stories. People tend to like those. And some weeks, we know, bring with them moments of tragedy or moments of celebration, and the community is generally extraordinarily appreciative of being met where they are, receiving messages of comfort and affirmation when they're deeply needed. And this personal feedback, Rabbi, I liked your sermon, Rabbi, I didn't like your sermon, sometimes is impacted by the individual opinions of those in our community. Rabbi, I liked your sermon because I agree with you. Rabbi, I didn't like your sermon because I disagree with you. Rabbi, you talked about current events too much or not enough. Rabbi, you talked about the parashah too much or not enough. This feedback is some of the most important feedback I receive. I welcome it. And that span almost 1 week long after a sermon ends and before the next sermon begins, these conversations where you share your opinions, these are the building blocks of relationship. This is what makes a sermon a conversation. And this is what transforms a relationship from me being a rabbi to me being your rabbi. This is why, in that span of almost 7 days between one sermon and the next, I eagerly await all the conversations I'll have, all the range of opinions I'll hear. And I've been thinking about this a lot in the past week because I've received so much from all of you, had so many great conversations with you. Yes, it's true that the range of opinions is so vast. I know factually I'm never going to get all of you to agree with me at the same time, but agreement isn't the point. Relationship is the point. And in the feedback this week, there was one thing that I heard that really stood out to me. And it stood out to me because it echoed something I heard from one of my mentors when I met with them this week. And so here's what my mentor said. Miriam, I've known you for a long time, and I know that you always play your cards pretty close to the vest. My mentor continued and essentially said, I want you to be more open. You should be more open. Now, of course, true to form, I didn't share my response out loud. I kept it right here in my thought bubble. And my response was, I know you always want to hear more about my personal life, and I don't want to tell you about my personal life. I don't feel comfortable doing that in my relationship with you as a mentor. But this moment still stuck with me, because in a way it echoed a piece of feedback I'd received from this community. Now, later on in the week, as part of my rabbinic duties, I had the opportunity and the responsibility to have a private conversation with someone. As you all know, these confidential conversations are a regular part of what rabbis do. And it's interesting, because Jewish community and Jewish religious practice don't tend towards the private. We focus on the communal. When a family celebrates a simcha, we sing and we say, this is a good sign, this is a good luck for us and all the people Israel. And yet, sometimes people choose to keep things private. Sometimes people need to keep things private. And sometimes there are good reasons for this. Enter this week's parasha, Parashat Lech Lecha. Vayomer Adonai el Avram, Lech Lecha me'artzecha, u'mimoladtecha, u'mibeit avicha, el ha'aretz asher areka. God said to Avram, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I resonate with this story in a very, very personal way, and I don't talk about it a lot. I'm much more open than I used to be, and perhaps my mentor deserves some credit for this, but I've had my reasons, and I still do, for keeping things private. This story of Avram, the story of this week's parasha, resonates for me personally because Abraham and Sarah, who received their new Hebrew names at the end of this week's parasha, are my spiritual parents. And when I say that, it's not hippie-tastic woo-woo. It's very practical. When I'm called to the Torah, or when I sign rabbinic documents, my name is Miriam bat Avraham Avinu v'Sara Imenu. On official documents like my rabbinic ordination, my name indicates that Abraham and Sarah, the exact same Abraham and Sarah from Parashat Lech Lecha, this week's parasha, are my Jewish parents. Of course, I've never met them. The relationship is spiritual. All of this is a hard story to tell, and so I tend to keep it private, even though, of course, it's never been a secret. When we looked at this week's parasha in our weekly warm-up Torah study, we eventually reached this question, why Avram? What is it about Avram that made God say, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you? The Torah doesn't say. And while we read many explanations in our midrash, we don't really know. I don't really know what it was about me that led me to a point in my life where I left the religion and culture of my parents to begin the ever-unfolding process of becoming part of a tribe that you're really supposed to be born into, even though you can make your way in, like I have, through a process of rabbinic technicalities that we call converting to Judaism. I don't really know what it was about me that led me to a point in my life where I realized that my idea and my plan of becoming a university professor wasn't quite right, that instead of committing myself to an academic discipline, it was the right choice for me to choose the path of Torah, the path of Jewish learning. But as I try to understand my path through life, my journey through this shared experience we call reality, I turn to the explanation that I learned from my teacher, Rabbi Adam Greenwald. We can find it in the Talmud in Masechet Shavuot, page 39a. There it teaches that when we were at Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah from God, it wasn't just the Jewish people who were alive in the time of Moses receiving the Torah. It was all the Jewish people of all the subsequent generations, which means all of you. And it was all the future converts who would come to convert, which means all the people like me. And as I try to understand what it means to receive Torah, I turn to another teaching from Talmud, Masechet Shabbat, page 88a. When we received Torah at Mount Sinai, God lifted up Mount Sinai and held it over all of us like a tub, like a big vat, and said, if you accept the Torah, excellent. And if not, there will be your burial. In other words, God gave us, all of us, born Jews and converts alike, an offer we couldn't refuse. I don't really know what it was about me that led me to convert to Judaism and become a rabbi. These teachings from Talmud help me to understand that this is simply my life. This is simply the way I am. But on a practical, day-to-day level, it's really hard to explain. Whether it's non-Jewish friends that I meet, whether it's people here in the Jewish community in LA or in the United States, or the lovely and well-meaning security personnel at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, who do essential work to protect Am Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael, it ends up being a really long story to explain that I'm a Jew and that I'm a rabbi. And the teachings from the Talmud don't seem to help that much. But here's what I've learned. Now that I'm in my 8th year of being a rabbi, now that I'm becoming a little bit more willing and able to hold my cards a bit further away from the vest, more willing to share the thoughts in my thought bubble, I'm one of those people in the world walking around with a complicated story. You look at me, and you don't see anything that seems that much out of the ordinary. Unless, of course, you're the security personnel at Ben Gurion Airport, then you'll know right away something's a little different. But for pretty much everyone else, the story about who I am and where I come from is a surprise, is a shock, is a long story that really alters the vibe of the conversation. And that has allowed me to have compassion for others who, like me, have complicated stories. Maybe it's their family history. Maybe it's their own Jewish identity. Maybe it's another aspect of who they are. Maybe it's something that they did or that someone did to them in the past. My own story has given me the gift of understanding that for some of us, life is extra complicated, that some of us have reasons for keeping things private. In our parashah this week, we read about Abraham and Sarah, the first patriarch and matriarch of the Jewish people, whose tent was open to visitors and guests, whose welcoming and hospitality made them into a blessing and a great nation. May we be blessed to extend our welcome to those with simple stories and those with complicated stories. And as we extend our welcome, may we be blessed to listen with openness and caring curiosity to the stories of all who come into our tent. Shabbat Shalom.